Welcome back, everyone. We are going to start the third unit of Anatomy 223 by going over Lab 6, the brain and cranial nerves. So just a quick reminder, we're not going to be going over every single term in this video. We're just going to be going over the ones that we feel are really important for you guys to get some exposure to before you get to lab, and then we'll leave a few for you guys to go and discover on your own or with your TA and DA. Starting off, we have some basic anatomy of the cerebrum, starting off with our cerebral hemispheres. We have the left and right cerebral hemispheres, so that's just one side or the other of the brain. These two are connected by this large piece of white matter called the corpus callosum. So this is a giant white matter bundle that connects the two hemispheres. This entire outer part of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. That outermost part. Each one of these individual little folds is going to be a gyri, and each one of those individual groups is going to be a sulci, and then a fissure is going to be a large groove. A good example of a large fissure is going to be our longitudinal fissure. That's this giant fissure going through the center of the brain, dividing the left and right hemispheres. A couple other structures. We have the lateral sulcus, which is dividing the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal. We have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is on the back. You can see we've had it separated right there. And then we have the central sulcus in the middle. For that one, I'm going to pull out a different brain so you guys can see it a little bit better. So, right here, in between this blue and red stripe is going to be the central sulcus. Just in front is going to be the precentral gyrus. Just behind it is going to be the postcentral gyrus. And those correspond to your primary motor and sensory functions. We're going to skip the conversation on major regions of the cerebrum. Those are pretty easy, and they're very similar to the bones that you guys have already learned. So we're going to jump into the cerebellum. Starting off, we have the cerebellar hemispheres, just the left and right side of your cerebellum that connect and sit in the back of your head. The outermost part is going to be the cerebellar cortex. These individual striations that you can see on the outside of the cerebellum, those striations are going to be folia. The vermis is this structure that's going to sit in between the two hemispheres. You can kind of see this sort of like groove, the vermis. And then on the inside of it, you can see all these little white lines. These are going to be your arbor vitae, which translates to tree of life in Latin, and it kind of looks like a tree on the inside. It's pretty cool. Next up, we're going to talk a lot about this specific model right here. Probably going to be your guys' least favorite model of all time by the end of this. Starting off, a couple different structures you guys need to know. The thalamus, which is right here, it's going to be the head of the seahorse. Throughout this video, you guys are going to be hearing me refer to this model quite frequently as a seahorse. You guys are going to have a PowerPoint that's going to help you kind of identify certain structures of the seahorse. So the head of the seahorse is going to be the thalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be the snout of the seahorse, which you can see right here. And then you have the pineal gland, which is the ponytail of the seahorse. It's this little pink ponytail sitting on the back. Next up, we have the anterior commissure. That's going to be the eye of the seahorse. The interthalamic adhesion, I think it kind of looks like an egg yolk, so if that helps you, we say these are like the earphones of the seahorse, or just like the ears of the seahorse. The mammillary bodies is going to be the Adam's apple of the seahorse, which you can see sort of under here. You can't see it too clearly, unfortunately, on this model, but another model we have that you can see it on is of the limbic system, and it's these structures right here in the center. So just those two in there. We're going to skip a couple of those terms right there, give you some time to work on those yourself in lab. The pituitary gland, we say, is the coconut that the seahorse is drinking out of, and the infundibulum is the straw. So if that kind of helps you with those, definitely helped me when I was taking this class. Next up, we're going to go over some more structures on the midbrain, starting with the tectum. The tectum is going to be tested as a region. We're going to look at the posterior end of the midbrain, and this area, this region right here, is going to be the tectum. You can kind of see the ends of the pineal gland stick out just above it. Then we have our corpora quadrigemina. That is this set of 4 rounded bumps that you can see on the posterior end of the midbrain. They are further subdivided into your superior and inferior colliculi. So we had 4 bumps. The top 2, the superior 2, are going to be your superior colliculi. The bottom 2, the inferior 2, are going to be your inferior colliculi. Next up, we're going to move to the front. This region is going to be the tegmentum. So this is the anterior end of the midbrain, sitting just underneath the pituitary gland, or more, I guess, posterior to it. Next up, we have cerebral peduncles. We say this is like the scarf of the seahorse. So if you take off this model, you're looking at your seahorse. When you flip it around and look at where that scarf would be, is going to be the cerebral peduncles. Next up, you have your pons. We say this is like the belly of the seahorse. That beer belly. The horizontal striations on the pons are going to be the transverse fibers. Coming down a little further, we have our medulla oblongata. This is the last part of the seahorse, kind of almost like what its tail would look like. And then you have your olive, which is going to be this pink structure right here, which is in between some of your cranial nerves, which we will go over in just a second. All right, next up, we're going to talk about this model. It's kind of a weird model. Imagine for a second you took some cement and you poured it in your brain, filled up all those spaces in your brain that are normally filled with liquid with cement, and you made like a cast out of it. This is what it would look like. So this model is a representation of the fluid-filled spaces of your brain. Starting off, we have our lateral ventricles. When we look at this model, we say that it kind of looks like a dragon to help you guys learn it. So these big wings on the side, the wings of the dragon, are going to be our lateral ventricles. Next up, we have our third and fourth ventricles. The third ventricle is the head of the dragon, which you can see right here. And the fourth ventricle is the tail of the dragon, which you can see right here. Next up, we have our interventricular foramen. You got to be careful on this one because there is a hole right here. That is not the interventricular foramen. Remember, this is a representation of the fluid-filled spaces. So the interventricular foramen is going to be just anterior to where that dot is. So just in front of it. We have our choroid plexus, which is all that pink stuff in here. This is what produces your cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk a lot about that in lecture. And then we have our aqueduct of midbrain, which is this sort of structure. We say it's like the body of the dragon. It's connecting the third and fourth ventricles. All right, next up, we have a little more conversation about our limbic system, responsible for a lot of our memory and emotions and stuff like that. Starting off with our amygdala. On this model, there's 2 points where it kind of comes to more of a bulb-like structure. That's going to be your amygdala. Behind it is going to be your hippocampus. A lot of memory stuff going on there. You have your mammillary bodies. Again, those are those 2 little dots in the center. And then you have your cingulate gyrus. Often on this one, I like to test on a bigger brain It's this gyrus just above the corpus callosum. So in this you can see it's represented as orange. All right, and last up, we're gonna have a conversation about the cranial nerves. Definitely probably one of the more difficult parts of this section, typically most missed on a lot of the practicals. So, starting off from the top, we have our olfactory nerve. That is gonna be cranial nerve 1. You can only see on the brain model, unfortunately. I like to think that that kind of looks like a Q-tip, and the olfactory bulb is like the tip of the Q-tip, and the olfactory tract is kind of like the center part or stem of the Q-tip. We have our optic nerve, cranial nerve 2. You can see it coming out just in front of the seahorse. So it's this piece right here. Next up, we have our oculomotor nerve, which sits just on top of your pons. So it's just above it. You can see it a little better in lab. It's just superior to the pons. Next up, we have our trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, I apologize. Cranial nerve 4 is our trochlear nerve. It's more posterior and it wraps around the midbrain. So it starts kind of just below our cerebral peduncle and it wraps around just below our inferior colliculi. Next up, we have cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, which is just lateral to the pons. So it's this kind of ball-like structure right here. Next up, we have our abducens nerve. It's going to be anterior to the pons right here. This is a good hallmark structure for a lot of people. We say the abducens nerve is like the abs of the seahorse because, again, we said the pons is like the belly, the abducens nerve is like the abs. So it sits right on the belly of the seahorse. Next up, we have our facial nerve, which is just lateral to our abducens nerve, lateral and posterior. Next up, we have our vestibular cochlear nerve, which is just posterior to the facial nerve. And then we have our glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Very confusing, so try and pay attention. We have our glossopharyngeal just underneath the vestibular cochlear. The vagus nerve is just inferior to the glossopharyngeal nerve. The accessory nerve is kind of this thin white line coming out underneath the vagus nerve. And then the hypoglossal nerve is going to be anterior to your vagus nerve. So it's kind of more on the front side of the seahorse, the front side of the tail. All right, guys, that concludes this video for Lab 6, the brain and cranial nerves. Again, a lot of these structures are kind of hard to see on these models, so definitely take some time, especially with the cranial nerves, to look these over in lab very carefully, and any other terms we did not go over. Best of luck on your guys' quiz, and I will see you next week.